On the day he was set to lose half his empire, billionaire Julian Merrick's pregnant wife, Serena, vanished without a trace. The police had no leads, his lawyers were powerless, and in the courtroom, his mistress, Talia, could barely contain her triumphant smirk. Everyone assumed Serena had fled, a broken woman pushed to the edge, but they were all wrong. Because the letter that arrived days later wasn't a ransom note or a goodbye. It was a declaration of war, revealing a secret so devastating it would not only expose the mistress, but threaten to burn Julian Merrick's entire world to the ground. The air in the Honorable Judge Carol Devereux's courtroom was thick enough to choke on. It was the kind of suffocating silence that precedes a storm, heavy with the unsaid, crackling with anticipation. Julian Merrick, a man whose name was synonymous with ruthless corporate takeovers and Chicago skyscrapers that clawed at the clouds, felt a bead of sweat trace a path down his temple. He never sweat. He sat at the defendant's table, flanked by a team of lawyers who looked like they were carved from granite and ambition. Their suits cost more than the average car, but today they offered no comfort. All their power, all their legal maneuvering was useless. Across the room, Serena's chair was empty. It was more than empty. It was a void, a gaping hole in the proceedings that sucked all the certainty out of the room. Serena, his wife of 5 years and 7 months, pregnant with his child, was gone. The hearing had been scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp. It was now 9:47. Judge Devereux, a woman with a fearsome reputation for punctuality and a withering gaze, peered down from her bench. "Mr. Wilcox," she said, her voice dangerously calm, addressing Serena's counsel. "Do we have any update on your client's whereabouts?" Elliot Wilcox, a man whose normally composed demeanor was visibly frayed, stood shakily. "No, Your Honor. We have been unable to reach Mrs. Merrick since last night. Her phone goes straight to voicemail. She's not at her residence. We are deeply concerned." Julian felt a flicker of irritation, sharp and unwelcome. Concerned? Serena was playing games. She had to be. She knew the prenuptial agreement was ironclad. A fortress he'd spent a fortune constructing. She was entitled to a generous settlement, of course, but not the pound of flesh. She wanted 50% of Merrick Holdings, the company that was more his child than the one growing in her belly. This vanishing act was a desperate, theatrical ploy to garner sympathy and delay the inevitable. He risked a glance behind him, toward the second row of the public gallery. Talia Voss sat with a posture of perfect, predatory stillness. Her legs were crossed, a sliver of crimson-soled heel peeking out. She caught his eye and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a gesture that said, "See? She's as dramatic as I told you." Then the corner of her exquisitely painted lips turned up in a faint, knowing smirk. That smirk was for him. It was a secret shared, a confirmation of their narrative. Serena, the fragile, emotionally unstable wife, finally cracking under the pressure. Talia was the future, sleek, uncomplicated, and standing by her man. The past 6 months had been a dizzying blur of that future. He'd met Talia at a gallery opening. She was a curator, she'd said, with an eye for disruptive art. She was also a force of nature, with eyes the color of whiskey and a laugh that could disarm a hostile board. She didn't see him as a husband or expectant father. She saw him as Julian Merrick, the Titan. She didn't want to soften his edges. She wanted to sharpen them. The affair had started as an intoxicating escape and quickly became an addiction. Telling Serena had been the hardest thing he'd ever done. He remembered the look on her face, not fiery rage, but a profound, shattering disappointment. She had been so still, her hands resting protectively on her swollen stomach. "I see," she had whispered, her voice hollowed out. "And the child? The child will be provided for." "Provided for," she repeated the words, tasting them like ash. Like an asset to be managed. From that moment, the woman he thought he knew, the gentle, compassionate teacher he had married, the woman who organized charity galas and read poetry to him in bed had been replaced by a quiet, steely resolve he'd never seen. She hired Elliot Wilcox, a bulldog of a divorce attorney, and defied the prenup. She wanted half, not for herself, she claimed, but for the child, to secure its legacy. "Mr. Merrick." Judge Devereux's voice cut through his thoughts, pulling him back to the humiliating present. "Given the unusual circumstances, and the potential that your wife may be a missing person, I have no choice but to postpone this hearing." She leaned forward, her eyes pinning him to his chair. However, let me be clear. If this is found to be a stunt, a manipulation of this court's time and resources, the consequences for the party responsible will be severe. The unspoken accusation hung in the air, that he might be behind it. The media, already circling like vultures, would have a field day. "Court is adjourned for 2 weeks," she declared, banging the gavel with a finality that echoed in the silent room as the judge swept away. Julian's lead lawyer, Simon Rourke, leaned in. "This is bad, Julian. This is a PR nightmare." "Find her, Simon," Julian hissed, his voice low and tight. "I don't care what it costs." He didn't blink. Couldn't. The weight pressing on his chest wasn't from the cameras or headlines he knew were coming. It was something deeper, more visceral. He didn't just feel exposed. He felt hollowed out. For the first time in years, the boardrooms, the lawyers, the money, none of it could protect him. This wasn't a game anymore. He stood, buttoning his jacket, a mask of cold composure firmly in place. He turned to leave, his gaze sweeping over the gallery. Talia was already standing, her expression now one of perfectly calibrated concern. She mouthed the words, "Are you okay?" But Julian's eyes were fixed on the empty chair at the plaintiff's table. That chair had been a battlefield moments ago. Now it was a gravestone. The chill crawling up his spine wasn't courtroom air. It was absence. Real, definitive, and cutting through the noise like a razor. The irritation he'd felt earlier was now being crowded out by a different feeling. Something cold and unsettling that coiled in the pit of his stomach. Serena wasn't dramatic. She was precise, methodical. Whatever this was, it wasn't a mere stunt. It was a move in a game he didn't even know they were playing. And as he walked out of the courthouse into a sea of flashing cameras and shouted questions, the image of Talia's smirk was burned into his mind. It was the smirk of a winner. But the unsettling feeling in his gut told him the game was far from over. The first 24 hours were a blur of calculated crisis management. Julian's PR team released a statement expressing deep and profound concern for Serena's well-being. He made a show of cooperating with the Chicago Police Department, sitting for an interview where he painted a picture of a loving, albeit strained, relationship and a wife who had been under immense emotional distress. Talia was his shadow, a constant, soothing presence. She made him coffee, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as he took calls. "She'll turn up, darling," she murmured. "She's probably checked into a spa in Lake Geneva, racking up your Amex just to spite you." It was plausible. It was the story he wanted to believe. But the cold knot in his stomach only tightened. Every word he spoke to the police, every reassuring nod from his PR team felt like theater he no longer believed in. And Talia's gentle reassurances? They now felt scripted, rehearsed, as if she knew exactly what role to play while the walls closed in. The breaking point came when he went to Serena's apartment. After the split, she had refused to stay in their cavernous penthouse off Michigan Avenue, which she'd called a gilded cage. She'd chosen a modest, elegant brownstone in Lincoln Park, one she'd paid for herself with a small inheritance. He hadn't been there in months. He let himself in with a key he hadn't realized he still had. The scent of her hit him. First, a faint, clean mix of lavender and old books. The apartment was immaculate, too immaculate. Not a cushion was out of place, not a cup left in the sink. A half-finished book lay on the nightstand, a silk bookmark marking the page. Her closet was full. Her passport was in the desk drawer. Her laptop sat closed on the desk. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of a hasty departure. It was as if she had simply evaporated. Then he saw it, on the kitchen counter. Next to a vase of slightly wilted daisies was her prenatal vitamin bottle. The lid was off. A single white pill sat beside it, as if she'd been about to take it and was simply interrupted. A chill, stark and terrifying, shot through him. Serena lived by her schedule. Her pregnancy had made her even more meticulous. She would never, ever forget her vitamins. She wouldn't miss them for a spa day. She wouldn't miss them for anything. This wasn't a game. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. He called Detective Hollis, the lead on the case. His voice strained. She wouldn't have left this behind. She wouldn't have left her passport. This isn't her. Hollis's weary voice on the other end was non-committal. "We are exploring all angles, Mr. Merrick." Julian's next call was to Cassie Tran, Serena's best friend since college. Cassie was a sharp-tongued investigative journalist who had always viewed him with thinly veiled suspicion. "Where is she, Julian?" Cassie's voice was ice. No preamble. No pleasantries. "If I knew that, I wouldn't be calling you," he snapped, his own fear making him defensive. "Did she say anything to you? Mention a plan? A place she wanted to go?" There was a bitter laugh on the other end of the line. "A plan? Her only plan was to face you in court and get what she and her baby deserved. She wasn't scared of you, Julian. She was disappointed, but she wasn't going to run. The only person she was ever truly afraid of wasn't you." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm looking at the woman who has the most to gain from Serena disappearing," Cassie said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The one with the smug smile in all the paparazzi shots. How's Talia, enjoying the spotlight?" "This has nothing to do with Talia," Julian said, too quickly. "Doesn't it?" Cassie shot back. "A quiet, simple divorce is one thing, but a missing pregnant wife? That makes you a grieving, tragic figure. It made her the supportive rock. It was the perfect narrative for a social climber. You need to open your eyes. You're a pawn in someone else's game." The call ended, leaving Julian standing in the silent, lavender-scented apartment. The accusation hung in the air. He wanted to dismiss it as the paranoid rambling of a hostile friend, but Cassie had planted a seed of doubt. He thought back to the past few weeks. Talia's constant reassurances, her subtle digs at Serena's supposed instability, her perfect alibi for the night Serena disappeared, a charity gala where she'd been photographed with a dozen city council members. It was almost too perfect. And that perfection, it no longer brought him comfort. It felt manufactured. Like a stage built just for him, where he was the last one to realize he'd been cast in the role of the fool. Every flawless moment now seemed sinister, calculated, as if she'd written a script and he had followed it blindly. The media frenzy had become a raging inferno. The narrative had shifted. He was no longer the worried husband. He was the prime suspect. Merrick's empire of secrets. One tabloid headline screamed. Another blared Mistress in the wings, accompanied by a photo of Talia looking coolly elegant on his arm. His company's stock took a hit. A crucial deal with Japanese investors was put on hold. The world he had built with brutal efficiency was beginning to fracture. He watched it unravel with a helplessness that was foreign to him. This wasn't a scandal he could suffocate with lawyers or smother with money. This was personal, and it was eating through the walls of his empire like acid. He was losing control. And Julian Merrick was a man who was never out of control. Days bled into a week. The police had nothing. The private investigators he'd hired, nothing. Serena had vanished from the face of the earth. It wasn't just silence anymore. It was erasure, as if she had slipped through a crack in the universe that only she could see. The city, which had once felt like his kingdom, now felt like a prison. Every stranger's glance felt like judgment. He was in his home office, a glass-walled sanctuary overlooking Millennium Park, when his assistant buzzed him. "Sir, a courier just delivered a letter for you. It's from the law offices of Wilcox, Bell & Associates." Julian's heart hammered against his ribs. Wilcox, Serena's lawyer. This was it. A ransom note, a list of demands, something, anything. "Bring it in," he commanded. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and formal. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he slid it open with a silver letter opener. Inside were two documents. The first was a dry legal filing, a motion to dismiss. Serena was formally withdrawing her divorce petition and her claim to any part of Merrick Holdings. She was walking away with nothing. Julian stared at the document, his mind reeling. It made no sense. Why would she fight so hard only to surrender completely? Why? Would she give up the leverage she had? Beneath the legal document was a second, smaller piece of paper. It was the same cream-colored stock, folded in half. It was addressed to him in Serena's familiar, elegant script. He unfolded it. The message was just one sentence. But as he read the words, the floor seemed to drop out from beneath him, and the entire mystery of her disappearance was replaced by a new, far more terrifying one. The note said, "I know about Nathan Cross. Forgive me for what I have to do." Nathan Cross, a name he hadn't heard or spoken in 15 years. A name buried so deep in the foundations of his empire that he had convinced himself it no longer existed. A ghost. Serena couldn't know. It was impossible. He looked from the note to the window, At the sprawling city that bore his name, the reflection that stared back at him was a stranger, a pale, haunted man. Cassie's words echoed in his ears. "You're a pawn in someone else's game." He had been so wrong. This wasn't about the divorce. It wasn't about the baby. It wasn't about the money or even the affair. It was about a ghost. And Serena hadn't run from him. She had run to protect him, or to expose him. He didn't know which was worse. Nathan Cross was not a ghost. He was a footnote, intentionally erased from the official history of Merrick Holdings. 15 years ago, Julian had been a young, ravenous entrepreneur with more ambition than capital. Nathan Cross was a brilliant, but commercially naive, software engineer who had developed a revolutionary logistics algorithm. It was the key, the very engine that would later power Julian's global shipping network. Nathan had the genius. Julian had the vision and the ruthlessness. They were partners. Briefly, a handshake deal. A shared dream sketched on cocktail napkins. But Julian had found a loophole in their informal agreement. He'd secured funding, created a corporate shell, and legally patented the algorithm under his name, effectively cutting Nathan out completely. Nathan had threatened to sue, but he was a developer, not a fighter. He lacked the resources and the stomach for a protracted legal war against the machine Julian was building. He'd taken a paltry settlement, hush money really, and faded into obscurity. Julian had heard, years later, that Nathan had died of a heart attack, a broken and bitter man. The guilt had been a small, manageable stone in his shoe, easily ignored as he strode across the world stage. Now that stone was a boulder, crushing his chest. I know about Nathan Cross. How? How could Serena, his gentle literary Serena, have possibly unearthed a secret buried for a decade and a half? He had paid fortunes to lawyers and fixers to ensure that Nathan Cross was nothing but a ghost. His mind, trained to see patterns in market data and corporate structures, began to race, desperately searching for a connection. He pulled up his security team's file on Serena, her friends, her family, her favorite charities, her online search history for the past year. Nothing. It was all books, art, philanthropy, and more recently obstetrics and baby furniture. Then he pulled up the file on Talia. He'd had her vetted when things got serious. Of course, Talia Cross. Born in Chicago, art history degree from Yale, a rising star in the notoriously cutthroat New York art scene. No criminal record, no suspicious connections. Her financials were clean. She came from modest means, a fact she used to her advantage, portraying herself as a self-made woman. It was part of her allure. Cross. The name screamed at him from the page. How had he missed it? It was a common enough name. A coincidence. It had to be. He started digging deeper, pushing past his security team's cursory background check, using his own formidable resources. He paid a private investigator, a man known for his discretion and ability to dig up skeletons, an exorbitant fee to do a deep dive, to reconstruct Talia's entire life. As he waited for the results, Julian felt the air grow heavier in his penthouse. Nights twisted into days, and he found himself staring at blank walls, haunted by every unanswered question. He realized he no longer understood the woman he thought he knew. That uncertainty tightened around his chest like a vice. While he waited, the letter from Serena changed everything. The police, informed of her formal withdrawal from the divorce petition, began to lean into the theory that she had left voluntarily. The media narrative shifted again. She was no longer a victim. She was a mercurial, unstable woman who had dragged a titan's name through the mud before absconding. Julian's stock price began to creep back up. The Japanese investors called for a new meeting. The crisis was impossibly abating. Talia was ecstatic. "I told you, darling," she purred, curling up next to him on the sofa in his penthouse. "She was just trying to hurt you. Now that she's shown her true colors, it's over. We can finally move on. We can be together. Properly." But Julian couldn't move on. Every word of triumph from Talia felt like salt in an open wound. He couldn't join in that celebration. Her happiness was a reminder of his own confusion and fear, a fear he couldn't admit even to himself. He was haunted. He looked at Talia, at her perfect face and triumphant smile, and for the first time, he didn't see a lover. He saw a collection of data points he couldn't yet connect. The investigator's report arrived 3 days later in a nondescript digital file. Julian opened it in the dead of night, the city lights twinkling below like a silent, indifferent audience. The first few pages confirmed the official story. Yale, the galleries, the climb up the social ladder. But then came the sealed records. The investigator had pried open juvenile records, family court documents. Talia Cross was born Talia Cernescu. Her father, a Romanian immigrant, had changed their family name to Cross when she was 10, hoping it would sound more American. His first name was not Nathan. It was Mihai. Julian felt a wave of relief so intense it made him dizzy. It was a coincidence. A stupid, paranoid coincidence. But he kept reading. Mihai Cernescu had been a brilliant man, but a troubled one. He died when Talia was 19. The cause of death on the certificate was a massive coronary, but the investigator had dug deeper, finding old police reports from the time. Friends of Mihai had been interviewed. They all said the same thing. He hadn't just had a heart attack. He'd died of a broken heart. He'd lost his life's work, stolen by a partner who had betrayed him. He'd become obsessed, spending his last years trying to prove the theft. Julian swallowed hard. He knew what it was to obsess, to spiral, to let a single betrayal hollow you out from the inside. But this was no ordinary grudge. This was generational retribution. The partner's name wasn't mentioned in the report, but the investigator had kept digging. He'd found Mihai's old academic records, his personal effects sold at an estate sale, and there, in a box of old papers, was a photograph. Two young men, barely out of their 20s, grinning, holding a napkin with frantic scribbles on it. One was a gaunt, intense man with dark, burning eyes, Mihai Cernescu. The other was a younger, hungrier version of himself, and the name scrawled at the bottom of the napkin, next to his own signature, was not Mihai. It was the Americanized name his partner had insisted on using for their venture, because it sounded more solid, more trustworthy. Nathan Cross. The room tilted. The air left his lungs. Everything, his power, his empire, his carefully calibrated persona, suddenly felt paper-thin, fragile. He was not in control. He never had been. Every moment with Talia over the past 6 months replayed in his mind, but now in a horrifying new light. Their chance meeting at the gallery, her fascination with his business, her praise for his killer instinct, her subtle poisoning of his mind against Serena. It hadn't been a romance. It had been an infiltration. This wasn't a love affair. It was a siege. Her plan, he realized with sickening clarity, had been diabolical in its patience. She had wormed her way into his life, intending to become the next Mrs. Merrick. But that was only the beginning. She'd pushed him to divorce Serena, knowing it would be messy. Her goal was to trigger a public, brutal court battle. In the discovery phase of a contested divorce involving half his company, his entire business history would be flayed open. Every document, every email, every buried secret would be subject to subpoena. And she would have been there, guiding Serena's lawyers, leaking information to her friend, Cassie Tran, ensuring that the name Nathan Cross would finally come to light. She wasn't going to just take his money. She was going to dismantle his legacy piece by piece, exposing him as a fraud and a thief in the most public way imaginable. She would inherit a ruined kingdom built on her father's grave. But she had made one critical miscalculation. She had underestimated Serena. She'd seen her as Julian had, a gentle, passive trophy wife. She hadn't seen the quiet intelligence, the sharp, observant mind behind the demure smile. Serena must have seen something, a slip of the tongue from Talia, an old photograph, a name mentioned in passing. She must have started her own quiet investigation, and she, unlike Julian in his arrogance, had connected the dots. She discovered the truth, that the woman her husband was leaving her for was the vengeful daughter of the man he had destroyed. Her disappearance was not an act of fear or surrender. It was a strategic retreat. By vanishing and dropping the divorce petition, she had single-handedly disarmed Talia. She had taken away the weapon, the court case that Talia had spent years preparing. She had saved him from public ruin. She had sacrificed her pride, her name, even her own justice, for him. And she had done it not with fanfare, but with surgical precision, in total silence. But the note, "Forgive me for what I have to do," that wasn't the message of a woman who was finished. That was the message of a woman whose own game had just begun. He had been so focused on the threat from Talia that he hadn't considered the one from the woman he had wronged the most. He was caught between two queens in a chess match he hadn't even known he was playing, and he had just been put in checkmate. The cold dawn light creeping into the penthouse felt like an interrogation. Julian hadn't slept. He'd sat in his leather office chair, the investigators report a toxic glow on his monitor, as the city he owned transitioned from a blanket of indifferent lights to the gray bustle of morning. The weight of truth bore down on him like iron. The lies, the betrayal, the ambition, all of it had folded into this moment. And in the ruin, only Serena's brilliance remained intact. A lighthouse he had ignored until it was almost too late. The initial volcanic rage at Talia had cooled into something far heavier, the nauseating weight of his own colossal stupidity. Julian Merrick, the man who could anticipate market shifts and hostile takeovers in his sleep, had been the easiest mark of all, blinded by vanity and a pretty face. But eclipsing even that shame was a profound, terrifying awe for Serena. The quiet woman he had dismissed as a decorative intellectual accessory to his life had proven to be a grandmaster of a game he hadn't even realized he was playing. She had seen the board, anticipated the checkmate, and sacrificed her queen to save a worthless king. He needed to see Talia, not just to banish her, but to understand. He needed to look into the eyes of the architect of this ruin and see the plan reflected there. He found her exactly where he expected to. In the master suite, a realm of silk sheets, walk-in closets the size of studios, and panoramic views of Lake Michigan. She was standing before a full-length mirror, holding a river of diamonds to her throat, a necklace from his private vault. She was admiring the way the stones caught the morning light, her reflection a portrait of triumphant ambition. "Good morning, darling," she said, her voice a contented purr as she saw his reflection join hers. "I was just thinking. This would be perfect for the Philharmonic Gala next week. A statement piece, don't you think? To show everyone we're solid, unbreakable." The word hung in the air, a bitter irony. He walked further into the room, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. "Take it off, Talia." His voice was a dead thing, devoid of the passion she was used to, devoid of anger, devoid of everything. It was the calm of the abyss. It was the silence before the verdict, the moment when judgment had already been passed, and all that remained was execution. Her radiant smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. "What's wrong, Julian? You look terrible." She turned from the mirror and glided toward him, her hand outstretched in that practiced gesture of concern that now looked like a parody. "I said," he repeated, his eyes locking onto hers, "take it off." Slowly, her hand went to the clasp. Her perfectly manicured fingers fumbled. For a moment, she laid the necklace on the velvet-lined tray of her jewelry box, as if it were a dead snake. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, longer than she should have. Long enough to betray the shift in the air, the silent collapse of a facade years in the making. "Did something happen?" she asked, her voice a little too high. "Is it about Serena? Did they find her?" "In a way," he said, his gaze sweeping around the opulent room she had so confidently claimed as her own. "I did some reading last night, a fascinating bit of corporate history about a brilliant immigrant software engineer named Mihai Cernescu. It happened, the thing he had been waiting to see. It wasn't a gasp, it wasn't a cry, it was a cessation of everything." The color drained from her face, leaving her exquisite features looking like a porcelain mask. A stillness descended upon her that was too precise, too practiced, like a dancer caught mid-performance after the music stopped. For one unguarded second, he saw pure, primal terror in her whiskey-colored eyes, the look of a saboteur caught with the bomb in her hands. But she was a professional. The terror was instantly suppressed, buried under a layer of icy confusion. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice brittle. "I have no idea who that is." "Oh, I think you do," Julian continued, his tone relentlessly quiet. He was the predator now, slowly circling. He found the name a bit difficult for American tongues, so he changed it to something more solid, more trustworthy. He preferred to go by Nathan. Nathan Cross. The name landed between them with the force of a physical blow. Talia flinched. He saw the flicker of her pulse in the delicate skin of her throat, a frantic, trapped bird. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "He had a daughter," Julian pressed on, his voice a quiet drumbeat of doom. "A smart, patient, beautiful daughter. A daughter who watched her father fade away from what she called a broken heart. A daughter who decided to dedicate her entire adult life to a single elegant purpose, avenging him. She would find the man she held responsible. She would study him, learn his weaknesses, his ego, his appetites. She would infiltrate his life, become his confidant, his lover. She would push him to divorce his quiet, unassuming wife, knowing the court battle would be a bloodbath. His words were slow, deliberate, like the final strokes of a pen signing away a man's life. Each sentence a revelation, each pause a verdict. He paused, letting the words sink in. And in that bloodbath, during discovery, all the old secrets would come out. The truth about her father, the truth about the foundation of the company. She wouldn't just take his money. She would gut his legacy, salt the earth where his name once stood, and stand on the ruins, finally vindicated. He let the silence stretch, watching the collapse. It's a brilliant plan, truly, a masterpiece of long-form revenge. His voice dropped even lower, half admiration, half accusation. The only problem is, she underestimated the wife. The quiet, gentle teacher, she never imagined the wife would be smart enough to figure it all out herself. And with one move, vanishing and dropping the suit, she took the entire game right off the board. The mask was gone. The confusion, the denial, it all melted away, revealing the hard, chilling fury beneath. Talia's face was transformed, her beauty sharpened into something dangerous. "So you know," she said, her voice a low, venomous hiss, "and here I thought you were just an arrogant, self-obsessed fool. I suppose there's a brain in there after all, buried under all that ego." "Where is she, Talia? What did you do?" he demanded, a sliver of his old fire returning. She laughed, a harsh, ugly sound, devoid of any humor. "You think I have her locked up in a basement somewhere? You've been watching too many movies, Julian. That's not my style. I don't get my hands dirty." "No, your precious Serena was just smarter than I gave her credit for. She saw the storm I was about to unleash, and she ran. She chose exile over annihilation." "You drove her away," Julian said, the words heavy with his own suffocating guilt. "I did you a favor." She spat, her composure finally shattering into 1,000 pieces of long-held rage. "She was a weight around your neck, a relic of the man you used to be. I was your future. And yes, I was going to take what my father was owed. What you stole from him." Her voice rose, filled with the grief of a 19-year-old girl who had lost everything. "You built this entire kingdom on his genius, and you left him to die with nothing but newspaper clippings and broken promises." "I offered him a settlement," he countered weakly, knowing how hollow it sounded. "You offered him pennies and a gag order," she screamed, her face contorted. "You paid him to disappear so you wouldn't have to see the ghost of your own sin. You destroyed him, and I was going to destroy you." "I was this close," she held up her fingers, a hair's breadth apart, her entire body trembling with the force of her hatred. Her eyes glistened, not with weakness, but with fury distilled through years of silence. Her shoulders shook with the effort of holding together a lifetime's worth of pain now spilling uncontrollably from the cracks. He finally saw it all. The raw, festering wound that had motivated her entire existence. He had created this monster. His greed had been the seed, and her grief had been the soil. "Get out," he said, his voice a low command, the only 2 words he had left. "Gladly," she sneered, her rage cooling back into a chilling disdain. She picked the diamond necklace up from the tray and tossed it onto the bed. It landed on the silk duvet with a soft, obscene thud. "But don't think for a second that this is over," she said. "You may have dodged the divorce court, but the truth doesn't just disappear because your wife did. It's out there. It has a name, and one day, when you least expect it, it will find you." She turned and walked out of the room, her back ramrod straight, a queen abdicating a throne she had never truly won. The silence that followed was not peace. It was aftermath, echoing with the memory of shattered illusions and truths too sharp to forget. The sound of the heavy front door closing echoed through the penthouse like a gunshot, the final punctuation on the end of his life as he knew it. Julian was alone. The confrontation had brought no victory, no relief, only the stark, chilling, undeniable truth of his own character. He had built his life on a sin, and the consequences were now playing out in ways he could never have imagined. Talia wasn't the disease. She was just a symptom. He walked back to his office, his legs unsteady. Serena's note was still on his desk, the elegant script a stark contrast to the ugliness that had just transpired. Forgive me for what I have to do. He finally understood the depth of her action. She wasn't just protecting him from Talia's legal ambush. She was giving him a choice, a final, terrible opportunity for redemption. He could let this crisis pass, let the world continue to believe Serena was simply unstable, bury the secret of Nathan Cross even deeper, and continue living his gilded life as a lie. Or he could face the ghost himself. He could do what he should have done 15 years ago. He knew where Serena was, not her physical location. That was irrelevant. He knew her moral location. She was on the other side of a chasm he had created, waiting to see which man he would choose to be. The one who took everything, or the one who was capable of giving something back. The man who deserved to be the father of her child. His hand, shaking, reached for the phone. He dialed the number of the one man who knew where the deepest bodies were buried. "Marcus," he said when his lawyer answered, his voice firm, resolute. The sound of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Cancel the meeting with the Japanese investors. We have something more important to do. I want you to find every document, every file, every shred of paper we have related to the founding of this company, everything on Nathan Cross." There was a stunned, protracted silence on the other end of the line. "Julian, what are you doing?" Marcus finally asked, his voice strained with disbelief. "That door is triple-bolted for a reason. Opening it now isn't just corporate suicide, it's vaporizing the ashes." "I know," Julian said, his gaze fixed on his own haunted reflection in the glass. The glittering kingdom of Chicago sprawling behind it like a beautiful, elaborate tomb. Sometimes you have to burn it all down to build something real. The echo of the penthouse door slamming shut was a starting pistol for a race Julian had been avoiding for 15 years. The fury and shame had burned away, leaving behind the cold, clear ash of reality. He stood alone in the cavernous living room, the city lights a glittering, mocking testament to an empire built on a rotten foundation. The disease wasn't Talia's vengeance. It was his own original sin. Serena's note lay on the desk where he'd left it. "Forgive me for what I have to do." He finally understood the crushing weight of those words. She hadn't just saved him from Talia's plot. She had handed him the architect's hammer, giving him the choice to either reinforce the facade of his life or bring the whole corrupt structure crashing down. She wasn't just saving him, she was challenging him. Challenging him to be the man she thought she had married. The man their child deserved for a father. For a long, agonizing hour, he wrestled with the ghosts of his past and the terrifying specter of his future. The instincts that had made him a billionaire screamed at him, "Bury it. Pay Talia off. Create a new narrative. Use your power." Power had been his shield, his sword, his religion. To willingly lay it down felt like a death of its own. He saw the faces of his board members, the sneers of his rivals, the disappointment of investors who had bet on his ruthless brand of success. Losing their respect felt like losing oxygen. But then he saw Nathan Cross's face from the photograph. Gaunt, intense, full of a genius he had plundered. And he saw Serena, her hand resting on her stomach. Her quiet disappointment, a judgment far more damning than any court's. He had managed assets, managed risk, managed people. But he had failed, catastrophically, to manage his own soul. The weight of that failure pressed against his chest like a steel bar, immovable and cold. For all his empires, for all his power, he had never learned the cost of integrity. His decision, when it came, was not a lightning bolt of moral clarity, but a quiet, grim surrender. He picked up the phone and called the one man who had helped him build and protect the lie for over a decade. Marcus Thorne arrived within the hour, his briefcase full of counter-strategies and damage control plans. He found Julian not in his office, but standing before the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking less like a king and more like a man on a ledge. "I've already drafted a statement," Marcus began, "all business. We'll paint Serena as tragically unstable, but ultimately remorseful. We can file for conservatorship, protect your assets from any future episodes." Julian turned from the window. "No," Marcus blinked. "Julian, this is a gift." She walked away. "We need to lock this down before she changes her mind." "She won't," Julian said quietly. "This was never about the money." His tone wasn't combative. It was spent. Not the voice of a man about to fight for control, but one finally letting go. He walked to the bar, poured 2 whiskeys, and handed one to his lawyer. Marcus, I'm going to tell you a story, and you're not going to try to fix it. You're just going to listen. He laid it all bare. Nathan Cross, the napkin, the patent, the paltry settlement, Talia's true identity, Serena's discovery. He spoke for nearly 30 minutes, his voice a monotone confessional. Marcus listened, his face slowly transforming from brisk confidence to slack-jawed horror. The whiskey in his hand remained untouched. Corporate suicide, Marcus finally whispered when Julian finished. It wasn't a warning this time. It was a diagnosis. Julian, this will be the end of Merrick Industries as we know it. The lawsuits alone, we're not just talking about Cross's estate. Every competitor, everyone you've ever crushed will use this as leverage, Marcus said, his voice low. Every contract will be under review. You'll be radioactive. I know, Julian replied. There are other ways, Marcus insisted, his legal mind racing. We find Talia. We make her sign the NDA of the century. We create a trust for her, anonymously. We bury this so deep no one will ever find it. We can still control this. Control. Julian tasted the word. It was the bedrock of his entire life. Look where control got me, Marcus. It made me a target for a woman consumed by hate, and a stranger to the woman who's carrying my child. I'm done with control. I want truth. The word sounded alien on his own tongue. The next 2 weeks were a controlled demolition. The board of directors was convened for an emergency meeting. Julian walked into the room and saw not colleagues, but predators who smelled blood. Before they could depose him, he announced his plan. Pandemonium erupted. Shouts of betrayal, insanity, and fiduciary negligence echoed off the mahogany walls. He stood his ground, weathering the storm, feeling strangely detached from their fury. It was the sound of a world he no longer belonged to. He worked with a new legal team, one specializing in ethics and restoration, not corporate warfare. Their task wasn't to hide his history, but to meticulously excavate it. He spent hours locked away, sifting through yellowing documents, digital archives, and old emails. He found the original patent filing, his own arrogant signature at the bottom. He found the wire transfer for Nathan's settlement, an amount so insulting it made him physically ill. Each document was a nail in the coffin of the man he used to be. The day of the press conference arrived, gray and drizzling. He stood backstage, watching the room fill with the sharks of the media. He felt a tremor of pure terror. The old Julian would have strode out there with an armor of defiance. The new one felt stripped bare, his only protection the ugly, unvarnished truth. He walked to the podium. 1,000 cameras flashed, a blinding constellation of judgment. Julian leaned into the microphone, his voice quiet but clear. Good morning. I'm not here today to talk about stock prices or quarterly earnings. I'm here to correct the record, not just for the last few weeks, but for the last 15 years. He told them everything. He didn't spare himself. He painted a portrait of a young man whose ambition had curdled into avarice. He spoke the name Nathan Cross with a reverence that stunned the room into silence. He confessed, in stark, simple terms, that the bedrock of his company was a theft. A man's legacy, Julian said, his voice cracking for the first time, is not the buildings that bear his name, but the lives he touches. I destroyed one legacy to build my own. Today, that stops. He announced the dissolution of his personal control over Merrick Industries and the creation of the Nathan Cross Foundation for Ethical Innovation, endowed with the majority of his personal fortune. He ceded the core patent, the engine of his wealth, to the foundation, free for public use. He was, in effect, giving away his kingdom. He didn't wait for questions. He simply said, "Thank you," and walked off the stage, leaving a firestorm in his wake. His next act of penance was the most personal. He went to Talia. He didn't call. He went to her chic Soho loft, a space curated to perfection, much like her life had been. She opened the door, her face a mask of wary defiance. "What do you want?" she asked, blocking the entrance. "To talk. Not to threaten, not to bargain, just to talk." She let him in. The loft was filled with art, sharp, angular, confrontational. He finally understood. It was a reflection of her own inner world. He didn't offer her money. He offered her a purpose beyond revenge. He slid the charter for the Nathan Cross Foundation across her polished concrete coffee table. "I heard your press conference," she said, her voice betraying nothing. "It was quite a performance." "It wasn't a performance," he replied. "It was a confession. Your father deserved a legacy, I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I haven't earned it. But I am offering you the chance to be the steward of his name, to build something with it, to help young, brilliant people, so they never end up like him." He looked at her, his gaze direct and stripped of all artifice. "Your whole life has been about his ending. This is a chance to make it about a new beginning, for him and for you." She stared at the documents, her perfectly manicured hands trembling. Almost imperceptibly, he saw the war in her eyes, a lifetime of hate battling against a flicker of impossible relief. In that heartbeat, the air between them shifted. It was the briefest crack in an armored facade, proof that beneath every calculated move was a young woman torn by grief and love. "I'll think about it," Talia whispered. And for the first time, he wasn't hearing the vengeful daughter, but the grieving one. Julian retreated. He resigned as CEO, moved out of the penthouse, and took a small, anonymous apartment downtown. The first few months were agonizing. His life, once a symphony of power, was now silent. He was no longer Julian Merrick, the Titan. He was a pariah, a cautionary tale. He walked the streets, and for the first time, no one looked at him twice. The freedom he thought he wanted felt like a crushing emptiness. He craved the fight, the deal, the win. He had to battle his own instincts every single day, choosing this quiet, hollowed-out existence over the addictive poison of his old life. He kept in touch with Robert Salinger, but their conversations were brief and formal. "Is she well?" Julian would ask. "She and the baby are in good health," Salinger would reply. No locations, no details. It was the penance Julian had accepted. He had to earn his place in that child's life, and he knew he was still a long way from doing so. Autumn turned to winter. The city grew cold. He learned to find a strange peace in the anonymity, in the simple rhythm of waking up and being just a man. He read books, the kind Serena loved. He visited museums. He was learning a new language, the language of a life lived without the need to conquer. One bleak December afternoon, a week before Christmas, a plain manila envelope was slipped under his door. No stamp, no return address. A courier. His heart hammered against his ribs. He tore it open. Inside was a single photograph, printed on matte paper. It was a picture of a baby, swaddled in a simple white blanket, its tiny face scrunched in sleep. The baby had a tuft of his own dark hair. But the mouth, a perfect, serene bow, was all Serena. He turned the photo over. Her elegant, familiar script filled his vision. It wasn't a letter. It was just 3 words. Her name is Hope. Julian sank to his knees on the hardwood floor, the photograph clutched in his hands. A sound escaped his throat, a raw, ragged sob that came from a place 15 years deep. It was the sound of a dam breaking. The years of grief, guilt, and longing exploded in that moment, each tear a confession he'd never allowed himself to voice. Tears of shame, of grief, of a gratitude so profound it was painful. They streamed down his face. He wasn't being forgiven. He wasn't being invited back. He was being given something far more precious, a reason. He looked from the photo of the tiny sleeping child to the window of his small, simple apartment. He had lost a kingdom of glass and steel, an empire built on a lie. And in its place, in this single small photograph, he had been handed the entire world. A world built on a single, fragile, beautiful word. Hope. The game was over, and in losing, he had finally won. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a missing wife or a cheating husband. It was a story about the lies we build our lives on, and the courageous few who dare to tell the truth. Serena Merrick wasn't a victim. She was a hero who understood that true strength isn't about fighting, but about knowing when to walk away, to let the truth do its own work. Julian lost an empire, but found his soul. A powerful reminder, the most valuable things in life can't be bought or stolen. They're born from loss, repentance, and the courage to choose hope over power. So the story is over. Our wonderful friends, are you still here at this hour? If you are, then maybe, just maybe, something about Julian's journey, about Serena's quiet strength, or Talia's haunting grief touched a place deep in your heart. If so, let's sit with that for a moment, together. This wasn't just a tale of betrayal or corporate intrigue. It was a story about truth, the kind that strips us bare and asks, who are you when no one is looking? Julian Merrick was a man who had everything: wealth, power, legacy. And yet, in chasing success, he lost himself. It took Serena's disappearance, Talia's vendetta, and the face of an innocent child to show him the cost of his ambition. But here's the beauty. He chose to change. That's the message we can all carry forward, that redemption is real. It begins when we stop hiding behind our power, our titles, our control, and start walking toward truth, no matter how much it hurts. As author Cheryl Strayed once wrote, "You don't have a right to the cards you believe you should have been dealt. You have an obligation to play the hell out of the ones you're holding." That's what Julian did. And that's what we can do too. Maybe you're carrying regrets. Maybe you've made choices that echo with guilt. But this story reminds us, it's never too late to build something honest from the ruins. So if you felt something from this journey, if it stirred something unspoken, I ask you to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Not for the algorithm, but so more people might hear stories like this. Stories that remind us that healing is possible, that forgiveness can begin with ourselves, and that the name we leave behind matters far less than the truth we live today. And maybe one day, just like Julian, you'll receive your own quiet message of grace. Not a grand apology, but a single word, handwritten with love.